Hello, greetings, and welcome to Film Fest DC and this conversation with four of our filmmakers of three films in our MetroShorts program. Uh, there will also be two other MetroShorts conversations that you can find on our website. The MetroShorts program is part of our DC for Real section that will go on the whole festival. You can see it. You can see it as many times as you want, and you can see it for free. We're really pleased to be doing that. I'm the senior programmer at the film festival and the co-curator Metro Shorts and the other shorts programs with my colleague Juliette Birch. Today, we have Susan Barocas is going to be our moderator. Susan has directed two other film festivals. She's made documentary films. She's has two paths in her career, professional life. One is films in all kinds of ways, and the other is cuisine. She's also a chef and writes about it. So, Susan, take it away.
Great, thank you, Linda, and welcome to all of you who are watching, and welcome to you filmmakers. It's really a delight to be here. I would rather be in person if we could, but we're going to have a really good discussion here anyway, and hopefully then meet IRL in real life in the future, perhaps. What's going to happen is I would like to briefly introduce the filmmakers, each of you, to the people who are watching, just so people can get an idea of who you are and where you come from. And then we're going to dive in and have a wonderful conversation. So first, Robin Hamilton. Hi, Robin.
Hi.
Robin's a filmmaker behind the documentary short, Our Alexandria. You are an Emmy Award-winning television host, a filmmaker, and a moderator. The founder and principal of a Round Robin production company, and you create videos for nonprofits to help with fundraising, marketing, and messaging. Robin is based in Washington, D.C., and she's the host of a public affairs news magazine program called This Just In. And the show features interviews with activists, political figures, and community leaders addressing current events, which kind of plays into your film a little bit, I think. So we'll get to that. Then we have Michael Skinner and Jon Michael Shink. Hello. They are the co-directors and co-producers of OVERSIGHT. So together, you are the lead producers for the award-winning production company, Pendragon, is that right?
It's pronounced Pendragon.
Pendragon, sorry, Pendragon Productions. And you have collaborated on dozens of films and videos, ranging from commercials to feature films and even sitcom pilots, which sounds fun. Your documentary feature, We Are the Ones, is a film verite following surgeons in South Sudan who are trying to use medicine as a bridge for peace between tribes. And this film toured festivals in 2016 and is available on Amazon and iTunes. And, you know, the films that you make clearly have a certain mission, so to speak, and we'll get into that. LANDFILL was written and directed by Heidi Scott. And Heidi's a professor at the University of Maryland Honors College. In addition to two short films, Heidi has written two books and a stage play. And I understand your research focuses on the environmental humanities, interesting meeting of science and humanities, especially how ecological ideas emerged in British literary works in the 19th century. So it's interesting to look at history and how it's come into the present. Also, Heidi looks at how energy sourcing has evolved through industrial culture to our fossil fuel regime that we currently have. So let's dive into some questions. And I'm going to start with the one that someone in the audience always asks at every film festival and every talkback. And that is, you know, why did you make this film? How did you get to the material? And specifically, it's, you know, where are the connections? How did you connect with the story? What was the special lens through which you wrote and directed the film? And let's start with Jon Michael and Michael. Perhaps you could start us off and talk about how this story fits into the overall mission of your production company. And, you work a lot at the intersection of storytelling and social science research. So perhaps you could start there.
Sure. So this is Michael Skinner over at Pendragon, and you're right. We tend to gravitate towards stories that have some sort of social mission associated with them, and it's sometimes we are seeking them out, and other times they just seem to find us, which we feel really fortunate about. But we have found that the best way to advocate for something is to really be able to help people to empathize with it, and storytelling is the most powerful way to go about doing that. When it comes to this particular film, we started work on this in 2019. And during the previous administration, inspectors general were being fired and accosted all over the place. And as residents in DC, we were looking around at DC wanting to achieve statehood during that time. And so when you look back at the sort of nascent government here in Washington, DC in the 70s, it got off to a rough start, and it wasn't until 1979 that the Office of Inspector General was created. So we thought we would take a look at, well, how does having oversight turn a city from sort of something that was really dominated by Congress to something that maybe is on the verge of statehood, and that was really kind of the impetus for that. I don't know, John, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll also add that we tell stories in a lot of different ways. It's one of the things that we really enjoy is sort of creative problem solving. With this particular piece, one of the things that was interesting to us just from a storytelling standpoint was being able to sort of make a documentary that's sort of investigative and sort of going back in history and sort of peeling back the layers to cases that maybe people feel like they know. That's not a muscle that we get to flex often, and it was fun to really dive in and do that for this piece. So just purely from a creative standpoint, it offered some challenges and gave us an opportunity to do some things that we might not usually do.
Okay, so the power of storytelling and filmmaking as creative problem solving runs through your work and is part of this film also. Terrific. So Robin, your work is guided by the principle of providing information that can help transformation. And, it's like the whole thing about, you don't know where you're going if you don't know where you came from.
Yes.
And yeah, so if you could talk to us about how you came to this story and how it fits into your work.
Sure, absolutely. Well, I have to stop myself and say congratulations to all these filmmakers. I've actually heard about Jon and Michael, because wasn't your Sudan story nominated for an Emmy? Is that true?
Actually, that one was not, but a previous film that we did, Solar for All, solar efforts here in DC, was nominated. And
okay, congratulations.
Thank you.
So, yes,
thank you.
I am impressed with your work. So anyway, I am in many respects with the rest of our panel. I do believe that film can be a form of activism. I do think it can impact change. And that's one of the reasons why I decided to take this path, was because my background was as a journalist. And I really wanted to find a way to expand on the skills and tools that I accumulated while I was growing up as a reporter. So in short, I came across Our Alexandria because I was working on another project about Mary Church Terrell, and I was screening it at the Alexandria Black History Museum. And the executive director just happened to say in passing, "Oh, right now we have an exhibit, just so you know, about these miniatures that capture the history of our Alexandria. And if you want to meet the creators of these miniature dollhouses, just go over and talk to them." And first of all, it's not often that you get to meet the artists who have created works that are in museums. And I went over there and just talked to the two of them, Sharon Fraser and Linwood Smith. They were so charming. And what I thought was beautiful about their work is it has a very childlike quality behind, and the backdrop is Jim Crow. And so they're able to combine loving memories of each other and how they survived a very difficult time in Alexandria's history. And what was even more powerful is because the city is changing, a lot of the historical landmarks that were there have slowly been erased. And so this village that they have created really captures some of the old places that they used to visit that hold very fond memories for them.
Yeah, I think that sometimes we don't realize what will have meaning. As they were growing up, certainly it may have been a wonderful way to grow up, but they didn't realize what this would mean in the future, or even what the context and backdrop was to their childhoods and to their life as they were growing up in this kind of almost like a enclave, a village. I love how so often films are the result of some fateful, unexpected meeting or something someone says, and you just go, oh, and it clicks with you, you know. So that sounds like that happened for you.
That's exactly what happened.
Yeah, it's really lovely. Heidi, so your filmmaking, that intersection of ecology, identity, consumer culture, art, there's all kinds of intersections. And unlike the other two, you're not that films that are here today. We're not talking about past in the same way, and also yours is a feature, whereas the other two are documentary. So tell us about where this story came from for you, how it developed, and kind of what is that connection that you felt to it?
Well, thank you. Again, I'm so excited to be here and have the opportunity to share this space with accomplished media makers. And I was a first-time director for Landfill, so I think that there were a lot of challenges in the moment to make this work. But the story leading up to my interest in the landfill as a kind of a geological piece of evidence of the Anthropocene, that is the era of man, began with my undergraduate studies in North Carolina when I did some environmental justice work on the placement of landfills, especially in Orange County, North Carolina. They tend to be placed in poor and often African-American communities. And this was back in the late 90s when I was an undergraduate. And that seeded the sense that our culture was okay with kind of mindlessly and continually creating this waste that would be around for hundreds and thousands of years, and then dumping it on people who maybe didn't have the political power to resist it, or, you know, and often the excuse is made that landfills are put in places where the land is cheap, right? And so that's a justification for the environmental injustice that comes with it. So back in the late 90s, I was cued to the landfill as this kind of amazing receptacle of human history that we want to go away, but that, you know, ironically is going to stay around to superhuman timescales, that is going to be around far after we individually are not around. And we might think of like the seventh generation ethos of, you know, Native Americans think seven generations ahead. Well, that's the legacy that we're leaving for 7 generations ahead right now. And I just love that the aesthetic possibilities of studying our waste as a kind of art form, and seeing that, you know, that these repositories of our values are perhaps more accurate of our culture than what we collect in museums and we want to preserve and show to future generations. So it started as, you know, an environmental justice project. My first job out of graduate school was down in Florida, where my campus was, again, next to a landfill with the methane wafting over. But it was right on Biscayne Bay, too, in the Miami area. And so there was this amazing kind of split between the utopia of the golf course and the seaside resort with palm trees and the again, environmental justice situation with a poor community that had been, you know, had this landfill planted in their neighborhood. So all of this was, I was marinating on all of this for a lot of years, and I wrote a feature script called Landfill. And in order to, you know, try to get the gears going on this idea, I selected a short out of it, and I found collaborators through the wonderful organization WIF, Women in Film and Video in DC. Awesome. It was just really eye-opening and exciting to collaborate with. It was only about 10 or 12 people, including actors, involved in the project. So I think that I agree with Robin that I kind of wanted to be activist about this, to show, to rub people's faces, and like, this is what things will look like in 2100 if anybody decides to dig in. But then there's also the element of how we may be throwing away things that we find very valuable in a future of scarcity. And so I was interested in the possibility that things like rare earth metals might be something that we actually go to mine in a landfill in future generations. So we think of it as trash, we want it to go away, we never want to see it again. And yet, what if we do a thought experiment of what the legacy of this is going to be? I think that we have many possible futures where our descendants will get a sense of what our culture was like and what we valued by looking at this museum that is in a tomb everywhere in your local community. And of course, I visited the Prince George's County landfill, my personal landfill where my trash has gone for the last 15 years. And I lead students in community-based projects and filmmaking projects. And so they've gotten involved as well in recent semesters.
You know, it's so interesting because what you're saying, after I saw your film, I started thinking more about what am I putting in the trash, which I think is
That's the idea.
Wonderful, right? It's a wonderful outcome. Let's continue with you, Heidi, as we kind of get a little bit more into the history side of things. I'm really interested in this idea of what makes trash versus the curated artifacts in a museum. Like when we go to a museum and we see shards from a jug that comes from, some ancient world, was that trash at the time? Was there a crack in the jug? It got thrown out, so it was someone's trash, and here we have it in the museum. So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that and how these items are, whatever we find, are a way to talk about, preserve, think about our past.
Yeah, I think you're right. When you look at archaeology and work on, ancient cultures, a lot of the time what has survived through thousands of years is midden heaps, the heaps of refuse often made of like shellfish, or if that was part of the diet of a group of people. So a lot of the time the waste is the leading legacy of a culture that we're trying to find out more about. And I got a lot of inspiration from the archaeologist William Rathje, who in the 90s into early 2000s dug into landfills and started to kind of get a sense of how our demographic details affect the kind of waste that we create. So you can dig into a landfill and pick out, a perfectly preserved plastic bag and look into it and have a sense of class and geography and values by what is found in that waste. And so I think in terms of what is trash and what is valuable, we can only guess about what we're going to find in the 21st and 22nd century to be valuable. But one thing that I wanted to do was propel us 80 years into the future, and then kind of take a retrospect of this 21st century that we now find ourselves a fifth of the way into already plus, and see, what kind of stratigraphy, what actual layers might indicate certain things that might happen across the course of the 21st century. So climate change obviously was chief in my mind as something that would be interesting to see, digging at the year 2040, what might we see versus 2060 versus 2080. And then when you're digging into a landfill, you're digging back through time as you go down through the layers. And so there's a sense that we like to think all of our electronics are recycled, but there's still a lot of it just getting pitched in the bin. But will there be a point at which the culture will no longer tolerate waste in making in that way, and hazardous waste, and you won't find those in the upper layers of a landfill anymore? So I really wanted it to be kind of an archaeological, artistic project, and that's a lot of things going on at once, especially for an 11-minute film, and yet I think that the idea was we may be surprised by the imprint and the physical or the material cultural evidence that we leave behind, and the thoughtlessness with which we're creating that material cultural evidence. And Susan, as you said, the film may have made you more aware as you just chuck something into the bin. This is going to be around for a long time. So it's not a film that's asking people to think more about recycling necessarily. Maybe that'll come out of it, but more think about how your humanity is on display as you create waste, and how your culture is on display, and what do we want our descendants to learn from us by digging into these pieces of Anthropocene evidence.
Yeah, I think there's a really lot there. I want to move to Jon and Michael for to talk about your whole research process and how you got to unearthing, so to speak, the stories that you did. How did you find your stories, your subjects that you interviewed? How did you decide who to include and who not to include? You know, how was that constructed?
So this is Michael. Sure, this is Michael. You know, we cast a pretty big net in terms of looking at the last 40 years at what had been sort of big cases that the IG's office had handled in the, during that time period, and really tried to look for a variety of ways that these may have affected the city in terms of helping government to function better, to help government to take responsibility for itself and for its citizens. So we had a pretty wide net with a whole bunch of potential cases. And then we were trying to sort of cross that, I think, with, well, emotionally, which ones are the most resonant? You know, if you ask people who have lived here for the last 40 years, you know, which of these cases do you remember? A lot of the ones that are in here are ones that really jump out at people. You know, people remember the Harriet Walters case in terms of, someone who is perpetuating this enormous tax fraud. People remember when David Rosenbaum was killed, and really trying to find out and dig down into finding out more about, well, all of these kinds of systems fell apart and may have contributed to him dying when perhaps he didn't need to. So that was a big part of it, was trying to sort of cross that, well, what's important to a functioning city government, and what has emotional resonance, and what really sort of sticks out to people who live here and have been living here for a long time.
And just to add to that, also sort of what translates to the screen. One of, as mentioned earlier, sort of as we took the creative approach to this, was to create that sort of investigative style doc. And so one of the things early on that we wanted to do was film direct-to-camera interviews, so we could, and include Michael's questions, so that we could create this sort of dialogue between the audience, essentially, and our participants, so that this can feel like it's colleagues sort of reminiscing about some of these cases, and it can feel a little bit more informal. And one of the things that we wanted to do was film reenactments. And so as we sort of think about all of these things, it all played a role in sort of, not only are they cases that translate to the screen, are they cases that people have sort of a visceral emotional response to, and try to find something that fits there. And it was interesting. You know, Michael mentioned like what cases folks remember. It sort of plays out a little bit in the film, is, you know, when we go into the Benita Jack story, we sort of touch on it, and our interview subjects all had a response to even remembering that case because of the emotional impact and the emotional weight of that story, given that there were 4 young kids who were lost. And so yeah, it was a balance in trying to find that. I mean, you know, and you also didn't want to have every story be so heavy. You have to be able to balance that throughout the overall piece. And so while, you know, tax fraud is the scale of the fraud that Harriet Walters led is incredible, and it's you can, you know, you play around with that one a little bit more, let's say, than you might with something that's very heavy and very, very serious.
Right. Yeah, trying on a feather boa, kind of, that whole, that adds a little lightness, when you use music very well too, in terms of creating the atmosphere of the film. It had that feeling like this is an investigative piece from the very beginning.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm glad that translates. Yeah, that was definitely a process to layer the appropriate music to sort of guide the viewer along and cue folks into when they can allow themselves to breathe and have a break, but then also dive back into that investigative nature of the story.
Right. Very effective. And Robin, let's talk a bit with you about reconstructing the past, because you're helping reconstruct the past that also your film subjects are reconstructing literally, physically. So what was this process for you of your research, archival footage, interviews? How did you decide how to use them to tell the history beyond just these people are building dollhouses, which your film is way beyond that?
Sure. So what I did was, first of all, just talking to my subjects, Sharon Fraser and Linwood Smith, they were tremendous. I mean, when you get to talk to walking, living history, it's really just a treat. They lived through Jim Crow, something that most of us just read about. So that was my basis. And then I started to backtrack. I would go and look at one of the dollhouses, for example, that they modeled in their village. And it was the Eugene Robinson Library, or the Robinson Library, rather. And that library was the modern day Alexandria Black History Museum. But before that, that library was created for African Americans because they couldn't use the whites only library, the main library. And there were 4 men who had protested years ago and had gone to jail, and they had since passed. But I used that as a marker for this miniature library that they created in this village. And that told, again, a piece of the puzzle about why that was a sanctuary for a lot of African-American kids who couldn't go get books at the main library, and why it reflected the painful the painful dynamic of Jim Crow. And I was also very fortunate to find one woman, Frances Terrell, who grew up in the community too. And, I won't go into too many details, but she was very much impacted by Jim Crow and lost some loved ones. And Linwood and Sharon are able to reflect that in their dollhouses as well. So it was really weaving in the stories of these people, and then just going to the library and finding historical photos that match up almost side by side to what these dollhouses are. So it was really a fascinating and very fun process.
And they're preserving their history, but you're preserving it in a much bigger sense.
Oh, thank you.
So do you want to talk a little bit about, just quickly, that idea that you're preserving this history?
Sure. I mean, it's funny because I didn't initially start out to do that. I just thought the two of them were so fascinating. But I really liked what Heidi just said about, the basis of her film in terms of, what do we want our descendants to learn from us? And I've had people say, well, why are you doing something about history, and who cares? Or, what's the big deal? But when you're talking to people who have lived through something so painful, and when I was meeting and interviewing them, the prior administration was, reflected mindset of people who wanted to return to a certain time in our history. And I thought it was important for people to understand just how bad it could be. Jim Crow wasn't some throwaway phrase that didn't really mean anything. I think it was very important for them to share their story, to explain just how damaging it is and how much you're harming society. I mean, you're losing so much talent by segregating people off and not exposing people to each other. And the memories are still very strong. I mean, when I go to screenings, before pre-pandemic with Linwood and Sharon, sometimes they would have to leave the room at the end of the film, and because it was so painful. But what was powerful was, from the time that I have screened the film, I have had more people come up and say, wow, I look at my neighborhood differently. I look at, how my community is changing and what we need to keep and why it's important to keep certain landmarks and what that can mean to preserve the past so that it informs us in the future. So I feel very lucky that I get to do that.
Lovely. It's so interesting to hear the two documentary shorts people talk about the impact of making the film on the subjects, that it was sometimes hard for them. I wanted to move on to talk about the short format itself, because I always find it interesting telling your story within the boundaries of a short film. And is it restrictive? Is it liberating? Are there things that got left on the cutting room floor that you really would have liked to included? Just if each of you can talk about that would be great, in whatever order you like. How about Michael and Jon? Do you want to go? Oops.
I would just say that we really enjoy the short format. I think it does pose challenges, but I think again, we talked about sort of creative problem solving earlier. Restrictions can be really good because it can allow you to think of creative ways to tell stories in ways that are engaging. I also think, frankly, there are more stories that are available to be told in a short format. The longer form stories require a significant enough journey to support that. And that the short format, especially the way that we're consuming media on our phones, laptops, every screen that you can think of, I think it's only going to be more and more something that folks pursue, that under 30-minute range, and really anything in between, because they're short, they're palatable, they're engaging, they're interesting, and they can be a catalyst to a much larger conversation or a much larger project in the future.
Well, and speaking of that, Heidi, you had talked about that your dramatic short was originally going to be something to lead you to a feature. Is that still?
Yeah, whenever I tell people that there's some hand wringing, because I think it's not good for the short format to have it selected out of a feature, and I'm completely aware of that. I had to make some tough choices, and I will say that the 11-minute version that is in this film festival, I think, is the best. I had an 18-minute version, and I think that the shorter shorts are the better way to go. You don't want to make like a pseudo getting toward, longer short if you can get the story across and the aesthetics and the visuals across in a shorter time period. What I had to sacrifice, though, was the more eco-feminist and gentle and exploratory side of the story, and I felt like I had to emphasize conflict, masculinity, and the uglier potentials. Maybe I didn't have to, but that's what ended up happening. So if there's ever a chance to make this as a feature, I would love to have this be a playful and almost comedic, if satirical still, if it's possible to be lighthearted about digging up trash in 80 years, to make a kind of comedy of looking back on us in this way, and to think a little bit about gender in the context of waste creation and gender in the context of a climate change 22nd century, and how we might be approaching landscapes with more care going forward. So intersectional approaches, of course, race matters here, class matters here. All of those things you can try to cram into 11 minutes, but maybe some of the longer form and slower paced scenes aren't possible in that short time frame.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Did you find that also, Robin? And
yes, yeah, exactly. And I'll just add quickly, my background as a reporter, I was a local news reporter in the past, and I found that it's great training for having a lot to say in a very concise amount of time. And sometimes that can be pretty impactful, even more impactful than something that's longer. And so I like what Jon said too, in that sometimes you become very economical with how you make decisions about what sound bites you use and what points you want to make. And I think, again, that can really make a very impactful statement, and it holds people's attention, and it really can be a great jumping off point for a larger discussion, which is ultimately what I want it to be. I want it to be the discussion, an assist for the discussion.
Right. Well, that's a great place for us to end. We've been going on a bit. This has been a wonderful discussion. And I think that you've all made films that do prompt further discussion, and people will. You know, I like to think, oh, they'll leave the theater. Well, they'll be home talking about, you know, seeing these films, and really, I think, thinking about the things that you presented. And especially also if, you know, people are residents of this metro area, as you all are, and as these films take place here, you know, this is like, as what Jon said, the short format is really sometimes such a key way to tell a lot of stories and to make an impact quickly. So thank you all so much. We're happy to have your films in the festival, and we hope people will tune in to, if they haven't seen them but they see this discussion, definitely now go watch the films or watch them again. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.